Good to be with you this afternoon. I always had a rule when I was a professor that I didn't want to be at the end of the day. But I am grateful that you're here, and I look forward to this discussion. I decided that I wanted to zero in on Wilford Woodruff. There's so much written about him as a missionary that I wanted to focus on what did he learn as a missionary that then becomes evident in his leadership style later on, once he gets back from the first big bulk of missions. So these are the things when you talk to missionaries and the missionary program in the church, even today, and it was the same way back then, we do missionary work because the worth of the soul is great. We do it because we want to help gather Israel and build the kingdom. And we do it because it really prepares the next generation of leaders for building the Lord's kingdom. And that's how it was with Wilford Woodruff. I'm going to have a couple of people pass these out here. So I've got copies of this so that you can actually follow it as we go along. Wilford Woodruff was baptized on December 31st, 1833, and then he almost immediately starts going on missions. Now, the first one, most people, you don't naturally think of it as a mission at Zion's camp, but it was a mission to him. He was called by the prophet. He was with the prophet. He's doing what the prophet wants him to do. And in fact, he gets asked to stay in Missouri after Zion's camp and help the saints there. So if you look at this chart, what you'll see is in the first 12 years of his life as a convert to the church, he goes on these 7 missions. And the missions are more than half the time of his first 12 years in the church. Now, today we don't ask people to go on quite that many missions. I guess there might be some of you that are older, my age maybe, who've been on several missions, and that's great. But Wilford really had a passion for missionary work, and it changed who he was in some very positive ways. And I want to talk about 4 of those. So to get at this, what I did was I went back and read all his missionary journals, the things that he wrote during particularly these periods that are on this chart. Then I asked people who knew his writings well and knew his later leadership style, so people like Jennifer Matchley and Steve Harper and others. I asked them, what do you think of when you think of what's distinctive about Wilford Woodruff's leadership style? And then I went back into the journals once I had all of that and said, now I want to find examples of where you see this kind of developing, some of these characteristics. So I want to talk about 4 characteristics. The first one I would describe as developing the habit or the characteristic of consecrated service. And this starts almost immediately after he's baptized, because in very early on, he's been a member just a brief time. So this is in 1834. He's been a member a few months. And here comes Parley P. Pratt, who is one of 8 people that Joseph Smith sent out to gather, hopefully, 500 people, 500 men, to go and redeem Missouri. So this is what we know as Zion's camp. Now, they never got nearly that many. But Parley P. Pratt meets Wilford Woodruff. He's 27 years old. And he eagerly agrees to go. He says, this is just what I'm waiting for. And in fact, he's one of the first 20 people to show up in Kirtland ready to go. And so Joseph Smith sends those 20 along with the baggage wagons on ahead to wait some miles away until they can gather all the rest. Well, if you read Wilford's journal, one of the things he zeroes in on, obviously it was great being with the prophet. He's being schooled by the prophet. He sees the Lord protecting his missionaries and those who are serving him. And he learns this lesson that he gains nothing but experience through selfishness. So what actually happened for that lesson to be learned, this is recorded in his journal, is that let me go back here. What he learns is that one of the saints in Clay County offers, after the enemies have disbanded, he offers some of the camp of Israel, you can use one of my rooms if you clean it out. Well, Wilford's group decides, let's run and do it. They run and do it, they clean it out, they put their bedding down so that nobody else can take it. And then there's a wave of cholera that goes through the camp. And they put all the people with cholera, many of whom die, in that room. And so they all get buried in those bedclothes. And then Wilford makes this comment, nothing but experience through selfishness. That is, you don't gain anything by being selfish. And that goes back to this idea that he was willing to consecrate everything. This is what he records in his journal on December 31st, 1834. He says, "Be it known that I, Wilford Woodruff, do freely covenant with my God, and I freely consecrate and dedicate myself together with all my properties and effects unto the Lord for the purpose of assisting in building up his kingdom, even Zion on the earth, that I may keep his law and lay all things before the bishop of his church, that I may be a lawful heir to the kingdom of God, even the celestial kingdom." So he's been a member of the church 1 year. But he's also been on a mission, basically, because after the 3 months that he's with Zion's camp, the prophet then asked him to stay and help the saints in that area, which he does. But he's fully dedicated now. He says consecrated service is what it's all about. Now that's going to lead to a second characteristic that he then develops. He already had the characteristic of hard work. I actually think if you survived in those days, you had to be a hard worker, especially if you wanted to stay healthy. And of course, he had lots of experiences as a hard worker, but he decided that he should work that hard in building the Lord's kingdom. And so while he's on his missions, he does some very interesting things. And his next mission, if you look at the chart you've got in front of you, it's a mission to the southern states. And he and his companion decide, well, we're going to go down the Arkansas River, cross the Mississippi, and reach Tennessee, because that's where we're supposed to be. So they basically hollow out a log to make a canoe. I don't know how you get a log stable enough to actually not have it rolling, but that's what they do. He reports in that mission to the southern states, he reports that he would work for the people that he stayed with. So he'd spend the day helping, and then he'd preach at night. So that was a very common kind of pattern for him. He then has this entry in his journal. He says, this is on the 24th of March, he says, "After traveling some 10 miles through mud, I was taken lame with a sharp pain in my knee. I sat down on a log. My companion, who was anxious to get to his home in Kirtland, left me sitting in an alligator swamp. I did not see him again for 2 years. I knelt down in the mud and prayed, and the Lord healed me, and I went on my way rejoicing." So those are some examples of early on really working hard and enjoying it, no matter what the circumstances. This was an interesting little tidbit I found. This is on his third mission, which is to the Fox Islands, and this is where he meets Phoebe's family and meets with some of his own ancestors, his own relatives, and baptizes them. So he's been preaching during the day. He he comes home in the evening after preaching, which would have been an evening service, so he probably gets home at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And then he starts talking to his uncle and his aunt and their household, talking to them about the church. At 2 a.m., they decide, we're ready to be baptized. So he goes outside and they baptize all three of them. And he couldn't be happier. Okay? So the idea of long days meant nothing to him. I mean, he'd been a hard worker before, but now he really loves it because he loves the purpose. Now, every missionary, these first two things, if you can convince any new young missionary, consecrated service and joyfully doing hard work, you're going to have a great missionary. Well, he's got that down, and he's only been a member a year and a half, you know. But now he's going to do even more. So let's look forward here. Just talked about that one. Oops, wrong way. Let's move to a third characteristic. This is opening his mouth, trusting that God would fill it and the Spirit would provide a second witness. Now, most of you would be familiar with section 33 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Open your mouth. We actually, in England, all of the missions in England, when my wife and I were there in London, we called them OIMs. And the idea was, if you could get a missionary to open their mouth at least 10 times a day to a stranger and talk about the gospel, then they would find people to teach. But you had to get them to open their mouth. So if you read these middle verses here, 9, 10, and 11, yea, open your mouth and spare not, you shall be laden with sheaves. Yea, open your mouths and they shall be filled. So this is something that he takes to heart. Wilford Woodruff says, yeah, I'm supposed to do that. So he talks to everybody. You know, he never avoids talking to people. One of the great experiences was after he was left in that swamp, he's on his Southern States mission, he goes to Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Wilford is not timid. There's nothing timid about Wilford when it comes to the gospel. He goes to the best inn in Memphis. So he probably asked somebody, where's the best inn? It's run by a proprietor named Jackson. And he says, I don't have any money, but would you feed me and put me up for the night? And Mr. Jackson says, what do you do? He says, I'm a minister. I'm a minister, and I preach the gospel. Well, this is a very upscale inn, and he says, and of course, here's Wilford. He's still covered in mud. You know, this is he's just come on that 10 more miles before he gets to there. He's covered in mud, and the guy thinks this guy doesn't preach. But he thinks we're going to have some fun. So he says, I'll do it if you'll preach tonight to my friends. He gets 500 people there, this Mr. Jackson. Well, Wilford says, let's go for a song. Nobody wants to sing. He says, I don't have a good voice for singing. So he reads the words. Then Wilford says, I'm going to say a prayer. He kneels down, and the dozen men closest to him all kneel down with him. Now they're all dressed in, he calls them broadcloth and silk suits. They're the upscale population of Memphis. He says the prayer, and he says a very interesting thing. He says to his Father in heaven, he says, please let me know the hearts of these people so that I can preach something that will reach them. He stands up and he starts preaching. And he tells them the thoughts of their heart. Well, it turns out these guys aren't the most upstanding moral characters. And he actually reveals all of this. He preaches for an hour and a half. He writes in his journal, "That was one of my best sermons." You know? And of course, they thought they were going to make fun of him because of it. He says within 3 minutes of after closing, the room is empty and he's alone. And then he goes up to bed, and he hears them in the room next door. And they're all asking, "How did he know? How did that Mormon fellow know what we are like?" They can't figure it out. And then they get into a doctrinal argument, and Wilford drops off to sleep. But he was not afraid to open his mouth. Okay? It was mentioned earlier about this experience with the constable. He's only been at the Benbow farm for a few days when the minister in town sends out the constable to arrest him. Well, he actually says, "Here, take my chair." He has him sit right next to him. So he's sitting up in front, just like Wilford would have been. And then he gives a sermon, and then he invites people to come forward for baptism, and the constable comes forward. So you heard about that experience, but that's Wilford. He's very willing to open his mouth. I can let this constable hear what I have to say. I don't have to hide anything. This is a picture of the Benbow farm, which you saw earlier. Let me go to the fourth characteristic. That's exact obedience while trusting God's purposes. Oftentimes people get promptings, but if they don't know what the purpose is of the prompting, they're reluctant to do it. Wilford was not. Just give you a couple of examples. When Wilford led a group of families from the Fox Islands at the end of that mission, heading west to gather with the saints, Phoebe takes deathly ill, what they call brain fever, which could have been something like meningitis or something like that. When death seems imminent, Wilford lays his hands on her head and offers her to God. Now, he hasn't been married all that long. I mean, they've got a baby, so it's probably been 18 months or plus or minus a month or two. And he's willing to say, "Lord, it's in your hands." The next night, Wilford looks on, thinking that she's actually died. And so do the other women that are traveling with the group who were there. Phoebe then tells him afterwards that she is still in the room, the spirit is. These two angels come in to meet her and say, "Phoebe, you have the option of remaining if you'll stand with Wilford through life's troubles." She says, "I'll stay." And then her spirit returns to her body. Within a couple of days, they're on their way again. But Wilford senses when the spirit comes back into her body, he senses something's changed. And so then he anoints her and blesses her that she will live at that point. But clearly he's following the promptings of the Spirit and doing what the Lord would have him do. Another time that is a great example is on August 8th, 1839. Oh, let me go for the first one, D&C 118. Remember, the saints had been driven out of far west by this time, but section 118 says that the apostles are to leave for England to go across the waters to be missionaries from this site on a specific day. Well, you can imagine there are people saying, "Well, it's not safe. You can leave from anywhere. There's a mission in England. It's not in the far west." But half a dozen of the apostles, including Wilford Woodruff, who's been called but hasn't yet been ordained, because he got his calling while he was in the Fox Islands to be an apostle, but he hadn't yet been ordained. other apostles to ordain him. He and these half a dozen, they go to far west, and at 2 a.m., he gets ordained an apostle. And so do a couple of others, and then they leave from there to go on their mission. However, what they first do is they go back to where their families are. On August 8th, he departs with John Taylor, who is going to become the president of the church right before him. They depart for England, but he's so sick, he lies down on a piece of leather, is what it describes, next to the post office. Along comes Joseph Smith, and he says, Brother Woodruff, you started upon your mission. Wilford says, yes. Said I, but I feel and look more like a subject for the dissecting room than a missionary. Joseph replies, what did you say that for? Get up and go along. All will be right. And so he does. He gets up and he goes. He's still somewhat sick, but they go. And this is the mission that goes where he goes to the potteries in England. I want to take just one other quick example, and that is what got him down to Benbow Farms. So he had been baptizing for about 6 weeks up in the Potteries district. So that was his assigned area. He actually says in his journal, I was assigned to this area. All these villages that are referred to as the Potteries area. On his 33rd birthday, so that's March 1st, it's a Sunday, he preaches twice during the day, and then there's a third meeting in the evening. And during the opening song, he's told very clearly in his mind that this will be your last meeting. Now, he's already got appointments. He's baptized several people. The work is actually going really well on the Potteries. But he's got this impression, this is my last meeting, so he stands up and announces it. And he says, I'm sorry, but this is the last time I'll be able to preach to you. He doesn't yet know where he's going, so the next morning, after he finishes that day's work and preaches, and there were some people actually baptized after that meeting, the next morning he goes out to a secluded place and asks the Lord where he should go. And he's told south. So he starts south. And he keeps, in his journal, he says how far he went and how far each day. It takes him 2 days. And then some walking, and he walks up to the Benbow Farm. The experience with the constable is at the end of that week. So, not only does he get to the Benbow Farm, 2 days later he baptizes the Benbows, and then he's meeting all of these United Brothers. Now, he didn't know why he was going south, because he's leaving a very productive area for potteries, but going south. But he did it, because that's what the Lord wanted him to do. And this is what he reflects on at the end of 1840, that it shows the importance of carefully listening to the still small voice of the Spirit of God, to listen to the revelations of the Holy Ghost. The Lord had people there prepared for the gospel. They were praying for light and truth. The Lord sent me to them. I declared the gospel of life and salvation unto them. And some 1,800 souls received it, and many of them have been gathered to Zion in these mountains. So this is just reflecting back on what that experience meant to him. So these are the 4 characteristics that I identified in his missionary service. Those early missions, you see this happening over and over again. I can tell you if every missionary could get these 4 characteristics into their habits and their characteristics, the church would be growing faster and faster. It's the same today. These are the same characteristics. Now, how do those then show up later? Let me just give 2 quick examples. He has several temple assignments. Basically, he is assigned by the Brigham Young to refine the temple ordinances. So this is everything from, are we going to wear white clothing in the temple, because they didn't start that way, to are we going to say the same words every time? It goes on and on. And obviously Jennifer's book is a great capturing of what some of those things are that he did. But he does it because of his consecrated service and his joyful hard work. In fact, he is the one who starts doing all the ordinances for the dead. And he's been writing thousands of letters to find out his own genealogy, his own family history, so he can do the work for them. Because he is so committed to them having the same blessings that he has. Then, a little later on, when he becomes president of the church, so in 1887, when John Taylor dies, he dies in July, it's clear that the apostles are not yet settled on who's going to be the prophet, the president of the church, and who are going to be his counselors. And so for 19 months, there is no first presidency, because Wilford is unwilling to act on this until there's a unity of the apostleship. So instead, he's obviously the senior apostle. Everybody knew that as senior apostle, if it's the quorum in charge, the senior apostle takes the lead. So he took the lead. But think about that, 1887, the middle of July, until the next, it's April of 1889, where he finally gets sustained as prophet. And this is when the Edmunds-Tucker Act, all of the polygamy things are going on. He's carrying this incredible load, but he's unwilling to act until there's a unity of the apostles. He finally gets that, and they agree to sustain him as the prophet and president, and his two counselors, who were George Q. Cannon, and that was the one that some of the apostles were having trouble with. He was the smartest guy in the room, and he knew it, and so did everybody else. But they hated that. So it was a real struggle. But Wilford Woodruff gets everybody there, and then Joseph F. Smith is the second counselor. So finally, they get sustained in that April conference in 1889. And you see his willingness. He has days and days of meetings with the apostles. And, people have to apologize to each other for what they said during some of the meetings. But he is absolutely clear, we're going to do this the way the Lord wants it done. All of us united and on the same page in terms of moving forward. And he does. But that's something, he knew that's what the Lord wanted. He knew he was supposed to be the prophet, and he knew who he should have as his counselor. But he wasn't going to force it on anybody. Well, those are some of the great characteristics of Wilford Woodruff that he learned as a missionary and refined as a missionary. And then they become, when he's prophet, he puts all of those things to great use. And it's exciting to just understand more and more about Wilford Woodruff and what a great man he was and what a blessing he was in so many different ways. For him to be calling these missionaries that we heard about earlier and getting their responses, well, he'd been there. He'd done that. He'd seen all of that. But he's very humble, he's very teachable, and he wants to do what the Lord would have him do. So thank you for letting me share this with you. I appreciate your time.